June 22, 1941, 3:15 a.m. Moscow time. Joseph Stalin sat alone in his Kremlin office, staring at a telephone that wouldn't stop ringing. He wasn't answering it. For the past 45 minutes, reports had been flooding in from the western border. German aircraft were bombing Soviet cities. German artillery was shelling Soviet positions. German tanks were crossing into Soviet territory along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The largest invasion in human history had begun, and Stalin had refused to believe it was coming. Now, sitting in the pre-dawn darkness, he finally understood the catastrophic magnitude of his miscalculation. The man who had survived Lenin's revolution, who had outmaneuvered Trotsky, who had purged thousands of potential rivals, who had bent the Soviet Union to his absolute will, had been completely deceived by Adolf Hitler. And that deception was about to cost the Soviet Union everything. The telephone rang again. Stalin finally picked it up. It was Marshal Georgy Zhukov calling from the Defense Commissariat. His voice was tense, urgent. German forces had penetrated up to 10 kilometers into Soviet territory in multiple locations. Soviet border units were being overwhelmed. Communications were breaking down. The Western military districts were requesting permission to counterattack. Stalin's response was telling. He ordered Soviet forces not to cross the German border under any circumstances, not to pursue German aircraft into German airspace, and to verify that these were actually German forces and not provocateurs. Even now, even with German bombers destroying Soviet airfields and German infantry overrunning Soviet positions, Stalin couldn't fully accept what was happening. He still believed this might be a rogue action by German generals, that Hitler might not have authorized it, that somehow this could still be resolved diplomatically. This wasn't ignorance. Stalin had received dozens of warnings about the German buildup. Soviet intelligence had reported the concentration of German forces along the border. British intelligence had passed warnings through diplomatic channels. Richard Sorge, the Soviet spy in Tokyo, had sent specific warnings, including the exact date of the invasion. Soviet reconnaissance flights had photographed German preparations. Soviet border guards had reported German units moving into assault positions. The warnings had been explicit, detailed, and accurate. Stalin had dismissed every single one. He had called the intelligence reports British provocations, designed to drag the Soviet Union into war with Germany. He had accused his own intelligence officers of panic-mongering. He had ordered the arrest of commanders who suggested reinforcing border defenses. He had convinced himself that Hitler wouldn't attack, couldn't attack, not yet. And now Hitler had attacked. To understand how Stalin arrived at this catastrophic miscalculation, we need to go back to August 23, 1939, the day the world learned that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact shocked the world. Hitler, who had built his political movement on anti-communism, was now allied with the communist state he had spent years denouncing. Stalin, who had positioned the Soviet Union as the bulwark against fascism, was now partners with the fascist regime he had spent years opposing. But both dictators understood the pact's cynical logic. Hitler needed to avoid a two-front war. If he invaded Poland, he needed to ensure the Soviet Union wouldn't interfere. Stalin, watching Hitler's military successes and fearing eventual German aggression, needed time to prepare. The pact bought both dictators what they most needed, time. The secret protocols of the pact revealed the real agreement. Eastern Europe would be divided into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland would be partitioned. The Baltic states would fall under Soviet control. Both dictators would gain territory and strategic depth. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the west. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. The two dictatorships met in the middle, dividing Poland between them. Over the next year, Stalin consolidated Soviet control over the territories the pact had assigned to him. The Soviet Union annexed eastern Poland, occupied the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and seized Romanian territory in Bessarabia and Bukovina. Stalin believed he was rebuilding the Russian Empire's western buffer zone, creating strategic depth that would protect the Soviet heartland from any future German attack. He believed the pact had bought the Soviet Union years of peace. He was wrong. The pact had bought him 22 months. By June 1941, the strategic situation had transformed dramatically. When Stalin signed the pact in August 1939, Germany was a regional power with uncertain prospects. France and Britain were still militarily formidable. The outcome of any European war seemed uncertain. Stalin believed that Germany and the Western democracies would exhaust each other in a protracted conflict, leaving the Soviet Union in a position of strength. Instead, Germany had achieved a string of stunning victories that had shocked Stalin and his military commanders. In April and May 1940, Germany conquered Denmark and Norway. In May and June 1940, Germany invaded France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The French army, considered one of the most powerful in the world, collapsed in 6 weeks. British forces evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving their equipment behind. By June 1940, Germany dominated continental Europe. The speed and totality of German success alarmed Stalin profoundly. The implications were obvious. Germany was far more militarily capable than anyone had believed. The Wehrmacht's tactics, combining armor, aircraft, and motorized infantry in coordinated operations, had proven devastatingly effective. The French and British had failed to stop them. Could the Soviet Union? Stalin began accelerating Soviet military preparations. Defense spending increased dramatically. New tanks and aircraft entered production at higher rates. Military districts were reorganized. Reserve units were activated. But Stalin faced a terrible dilemma. The Red Army was in the midst of a massive expansion and modernization program. New equipment was entering service, but crews weren't fully trained on it. Units were being reorganized, but the reorganization wasn't complete. Officer corps were being rebuilt after Stalin's purges of 1937-1938 had executed or imprisoned thousands of experienced commanders. The Red Army of June 1941 was more powerful on paper than it had ever been, but it was also in organizational chaos. Stalin needed time. He needed at least another year, preferably 2, to complete the military modernization program. He needed time to train crews on the new T-34 and KV-1 tanks. He needed time to build the new fortifications along the revised western border. He needed time to rebuild the officer corps after the devastation of the purges. Every month of peace was valuable. Every month of peace made the Red Army stronger and more prepared. Stalin convinced himself that Hitler understood this too, that Hitler would give him that time. Stalin's reasoning appeared logical. Germany was still at war with Britain. The Battle of Britain in summer and fall 1940 had failed to break British resistance. Britain remained undefeated, defending its island, bombing German cities, disrupting German shipping. Germany couldn't invade Britain without air and naval superiority, which it didn't have. Therefore, Stalin concluded, Germany couldn't afford to open a second front against the Soviet Union while still fighting Britain. Hitler wouldn't risk a two-front war. That was Germany's fatal mistake in World War I. Hitler wouldn't repeat it. Stalin had additional reasons for confidence. Soviet intelligence reported that Germany was experiencing oil shortages. German synthetic oil production was insufficient for a major campaign. German forces in the West were still occupying France, the Low Countries, Norway, and dealing with resistance movements. Germany had commitments in North Africa, supporting Italian forces against the British. Germany had recently invaded Yugoslavia and Greece in April 1941, dealing with the aftermath of those campaigns. Stalin calculated that Germany was overextended, that Hitler lacked the resources for an invasion of the Soviet Union, at least not in 1941. Perhaps in 1942 or 1943, but not now. These calculations weren't entirely wrong. Germany was experiencing resource constraints. German generals had expressed concerns about opening a campaign in the East. But Stalin made a critical error. He believed Hitler was a rational actor who would make decisions based on strategic logic. Hitler wasn't rational. Hitler was driven by ideology, by his obsession with destroying what he called Judeo-Bolshevism, by his desire for Lebensraum in the East.
Hitler didn't care about strategic logic. He cared about his vision of destiny. Throughout spring 1941, evidence of German preparations for invasion became overwhelming. By May 1941, Germany had concentrated over 3 million troops along the Soviet border. German reconnaissance flights violated Soviet airspace daily. German units were moving into assault positions. Logistics trains were delivering ammunition and fuel to forward positions. Soviet intelligence officers were frantically reporting these developments to Moscow. Every report landed on Stalin's desk. He dismissed them all. On May 5, 1941, Stalin gave a speech to military academy graduates. In it, he acknowledged that war with Germany might eventually come. But he insisted that the Red Army needed more time to prepare, that the Soviet Union needed to avoid provocation, that maintaining the peace was paramount. Stalin ordered his military commanders to avoid any action that Germany might interpret as threatening. Soviet forces were forbidden from mobilizing. Soviet border defenses couldn't be reinforced without Stalin's personal authorization. Soviet forces couldn't even adopt defensive positions.
The warnings kept coming. On June 14, 1941, TASS, the Soviet news agency, published a statement at Stalin's direction. The statement dismissed rumors of impending war between Germany and the Soviet Union as British propaganda. It claimed that relations between Germany and the Soviet Union remained friendly, that both nations were observing the non-aggression pact, that suggestions of German preparations for invasion were baseless. This statement wasn't meant for the Soviet public. It was meant for Hitler. Stalin was signaling that the Soviet Union wasn't preparing for war, wasn't mobilizing, wasn't threatening. Stalin believed that by demonstrating Soviet non-hostility, he would convince Hitler that invasion was unnecessary. Instead, the statement convinced Hitler that Stalin was blind to reality, that surprise would be complete, that Soviet forces wouldn't be prepared. On June 18th, Richard Sorge sent another urgent message from Tokyo. German attack imminent, he reported. Date, June 22nd. The message reached Stalin. He wrote on it, "You can send your source from the German Air Force headquarters to his fucking mother. This is not a source, but a disinformant." On June 21st, the day before the invasion, Soviet border guards reported that they could hear German tank engines across the border, that German units were cutting Soviet barbed wire, that German assault boats were being moved to river crossing points. Soviet commanders requested permission to place their units on alert. Stalin refused. Late on June 21st, a German deserter, a communist sympathizer, crossed into Soviet lines. He told Soviet interrogators that the German attack would begin at 4 a.m. the next morning. The information was passed to Moscow. Soviet Defense Commissar Semyon Timoshenko and Marshal Zhukov insisted on seeing Stalin immediately. They arrived at the Kremlin around midnight. They informed Stalin of the deserters' warning. Stalin finally, reluctantly, authorized a warning to be sent to border military districts. The warning was carefully worded. It told commanders that a German attack might occur on June 22nd, 23rd, that units should take appropriate defensive measures, but that they should not respond to provocations, should not cross the border, should not take any action that could be interpreted as aggression. The warning reached some units. Many never received it. Communications were poor, commanders were asleep, and those who did receive the warning didn't know what to do with its contradictory instructions. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22nd, German forces attacked along a 1,800-mile front. Over 3 million German troops, 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,700 aircraft began Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The initial strike was devastating. German aircraft caught Soviet planes on the ground. Soviet airfields were bombed before most aircraft could take off. In the first day, the Luftwaffe destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft, the majority on the ground. Soviet communications networks collapsed. German artillery had targeted Soviet command posts, communication centers, and ammunition dumps. Soviet commanders couldn't reach their subordinates. Soviet units couldn't coordinate responses. German armor punched through Soviet border defenses in dozens of locations.
Soviet border units fought bravely but were overwhelmed by superior German tactics and coordination. By noon on June 22nd, German forces had penetrated 50 kilometers into Soviet territory in several locations. Back in Moscow, Stalin initially refused to believe the reports. Even as the scale of the disaster became apparent, Stalin clung to the hope that this was a provocation, that Hitler hadn't authorized it, that German generals were acting without orders. Stalin ordered Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov to contact the German embassy in Moscow. Molotov met with German Ambassador Friedrich von der Schulenburg at 5:30 a.m. The ambassador, looking distressed, read a German declaration. Germany was invading to prevent an imminent Soviet attack, to liberate European civilization from Bolshevik barbarism, to secure Germany's eastern flank. It was a declaration of war. Molotov returned to the Kremlin and informed Stalin. Stalin still didn't speak publicly. Molotov delivered a radio address at noon announcing the German invasion. Stalin remained silent. For days, Stalin would remain in a state of shock, unable to fully process the magnitude of his miscalculation. The first week of the invasion was catastrophic for the Soviet Union. German Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad. German Army Group Center drove toward Minsk and Moscow. German Army Group South pushed into Ukraine. Soviet forces fought desperately, but they were disorganized, poorly positioned, and overwhelmed. Within a week, German forces had advanced over 200 miles in some sectors. The pocket battles began. German armored spearheads would penetrate deep into Soviet territory, then curve back to encircle Soviet forces. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were trapped in these pockets. The Battle of Bialystok-Minsk in the first week of the invasion resulted in the encirclement and destruction of most of the Soviet Western Front. Over 300,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. The Battle of Smolensk in July would result in another 300,000 Soviet casualties. The Battle of Oman in August would trap and destroy multiple Soviet armies. The Battle of Kiev in September would result in the largest encirclement in military history, with over 600,000 Soviet soldiers killed or captured.
By the end of 1941, the Soviet Union had suffered casualties that would have destroyed any other nation. Over 3 million Soviet soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Over 20,000 tanks had been lost. Over 17,000 aircraft had been destroyed. German forces had occupied Soviet territory containing 40% of the Soviet population, including major industrial centers, agricultural regions, and critical infrastructure. The Soviet Union was supposed to have collapsed by now. German planning had assumed that Soviet resistance would break within 8 to 10 weeks. Operation Barbarossa was designed as a short campaign. German forces would destroy Soviet armies in the border regions, capture Moscow, and force Soviet capitulation before winter. The campaign was behind schedule, but German commanders remained confident. Moscow was within reach. The Red Army appeared shattered. Soviet industrial capacity was disrupted. German victory seemed inevitable. But something unexpected was happening. The Soviet Union wasn't collapsing. Stalin, after his initial shock in late June, had recovered and taken control of the war effort. On June 30, 1941, Stalin was appointed chairman of the State Defense Committee, concentrating all political and military authority in his hands. Stalin reorganized the command structure, removed incompetent commanders, and promoted capable ones like Zhukov. Stalin authorized the evacuation of Soviet industry. In one of the most remarkable logistics efforts in history, over 1,500 Soviet factories were disassembled, loaded onto trains, transported east beyond the Ural Mountains, and reassembled in safe locations. Over 10 million Soviet workers and their families were evacuated with the factories. By early 1942, evacuated Soviet factories were producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition at increasing rates. Soviet production, rather than collapsing, was beginning to recover. Stalin learned from the catastrophic failures of June 1941. The most obvious lesson: his intelligence services had been right and he had been wrong. Stalin had dismissed accurate intelligence because it contradicted his beliefs. That nearly destroyed the Soviet Union.
Stalin began trusting his intelligence officers again, listening to their assessments, acting on their warnings. The second lesson, defensive positioning, mattered. Soviet forces in June 1941 had been caught in poorly prepared positions, many too close to the border to retreat effectively. Stalin authorized defensive preparations in depth. Multiple defensive lines were constructed. Forces were positioned to enable strategic retreats when necessary. The third lesson, initiative and flexibility, were essential. Soviet commanders in the early battles had waited for orders from higher command, orders that often never came because communications were disrupted. Stalin began authorizing lower-level commanders to act on their own initiative when necessary. The battle for Moscow in late 1941 demonstrated how quickly the Red Army was learning. German forces approached Moscow in October 1941. Soviet intelligence, using the spy Richard Sorge's intelligence from Tokyo, learned that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union in the east. This freed Stalin to transfer multiple experienced divisions from the Far East to defend Moscow. In November and December 1941, Soviet forces defended Moscow desperately, then counterattacked. The Soviet counteroffensive, launched on December 5, 1941, pushed German forces back 100 to 150 miles from Moscow. It was the first major German defeat of World War II. German generals, confident of imminent victory weeks earlier, now faced the prospect of winter fighting for which they were unprepared. The Battle of Moscow shattered the myth of German invincibility. But we need to return to June 22, 1941, to understand Stalin's personal reckoning with his catastrophic error. In the days following the invasion, as reports detailed the scale of the disaster, Stalin reportedly told members of the Politburo, "Lenin founded our state, and we fucked it up." Whether Stalin actually said those exact words is debated by historians, but Stalin's actions in late June 1941 suggest a man confronting the consequences of his miscalculation. Stalin briefly withdrew from active leadership. For several days, he remained at his dacha outside Moscow, meeting with no one, making no decisions. Members of the Politburo, fearing paralysis in leadership during the crisis, visited Stalin at his dacha on June 30th. They convinced him to return and take command of the war effort. Stalin returned, but he was different. The absolute confidence in his own judgment, the willingness to dismiss contrary evidence, the refusal to acknowledge error, all of it had been shattered by the reality of June 22nd. Stalin's analysis of what went wrong was brutal and largely accurate. First, he had believed Hitler would act rationally, that Hitler would avoid a two-front war, that strategic logic would dictate German decisions. This was wrong. Hitler was driven by ideology, not strategic calculation. Second, Stalin had believed that demonstrating non-hostility would reassure Hitler. This was backwards. Stalin's passivity had convinced Hitler that surprise would be total, that Soviet forces wouldn't be prepared, that the invasion would succeed quickly. Third, Stalin had dismissed intelligence because it contradicted his beliefs. This was perhaps his most fundamental error. Intelligence should inform beliefs, not be filtered by them. Fourth, Stalin had prioritized avoiding provocation over defensive preparation. This left Soviet forces vulnerable, poorly positioned, and unable to respond effectively when the invasion began.
The question that haunted Stalin, that would haunt Soviet leadership for years, was whether the disaster could have been avoided. What if Stalin had believed the intelligence warnings? What if Soviet forces had mobilized in May 1941? What if border defenses had been reinforced? What if Soviet forces had been positioned in defensive depth rather than forward positions? The consensus among Soviet military commanders after the war was that many of the initial disasters could have been mitigated, though not entirely avoided. If Soviet forces had been on alert, the German airstrikes would have been far less effective. If Soviet units had been properly positioned, the encirclements might have been avoided or at least reduced in scale. If communications had been better prepared, coordination might have been possible. But even with perfect preparation, the German invasion would have been a crisis. German forces in June 1941 were at their peak effectiveness, their tactics refined by campaigns in Poland and France, their confidence high.
The deeper question was whether Stalin could have avoided the war entirely. Some historians argue that if Stalin had mobilized Soviet forces, deployed them threateningly near the German border, Germany might have delayed or abandoned the invasion. This seems unlikely. Hitler was committed to destroying the Soviet Union. The Nazi ideology required it. Lebensraum, the concept of living space for Germans in the East, was central to Hitler's vision. The destruction of what Hitler called Judeo-Bolshevism was a core Nazi goal. Hitler was going to invade eventually. The only question was timing. Other historians argue that Stalin's passivity actually benefited the Soviet Union in the long term. By allowing Hitler to cast Germany as the aggressor, Stalin secured Allied support. Britain and the United States provided massive assistance to the Soviet Union precisely because the Soviet Union was the victim of Nazi aggression. If Stalin had mobilized threateningly, if Soviet forces had appeared to be preparing for attack, the moral clarity of the situation would have been muddied. This argument has merit, but it's cold comfort. The initial catastrophe of Operation Barbarossa cost the Soviet Union millions of lives and enormous territory. Stalin's miscalculation contributed directly to that catastrophe. The long-term strategic benefits of being the clear victim of aggression were real, but they came at an almost unbearable human cost. The statistics are almost incomprehensible. By the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had lost approximately 27 million people, both military and civilian. No nation in history had ever sustained casualties on that scale. The causes were multiple: German brutality, ideological warfare, the nature of the Eastern Front's combat, Soviet strategic errors, Stalin's purges weakening the military, economic disruption, famine, and disease. But the initial catastrophe, the disaster of June-December 1941, set the tone for everything that followed. If Soviet forces had been better prepared, if the initial German advances had been slower, if more soldiers had escaped encirclement, the death toll might have been significantly lower. Stalin's personal accountability for the disaster was something he never publicly acknowledged. Soviet propaganda during and after the war portrayed Stalin as the wise leader who had guided the Soviet Union to victory. The catastrophic failures of 1941 were attributed to surprise, to German numerical superiority, to initial disadvantages that Stalin's brilliant leadership eventually overcame. This narrative was false, but it served Stalin's political needs. Privately, Stalin acknowledged some responsibility. In conversations with military commanders, Stalin occasionally admitted errors in judgment. But public accountability was impossible. Stalin's entire political position rested on the cult of personality, on the image of Stalin as infallible leader. Admitting the catastrophic miscalculation of June 1941 would have undermined that image fundamentally. The Soviet Union's eventual victory in World War II came despite, not because of, Stalin's decisions in 1939 to 1941. The factors that enabled Soviet survival and eventual victory were multiple. Soviet industrial capacity, once evacuated and reorganized, proved capable of outproducing Germany in tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. The Soviet population's willingness to endure unimaginable suffering and continue fighting provided resilience that German planners hadn't anticipated. The immense geography of the Soviet Union provided strategic depth that absorbed German advances. The harsh Russian winter disrupted German operations repeatedly. Allied assistance, particularly American Lend-Lease aid, provided critical supplies. But perhaps most importantly, the Red Army learned. The incompetent commanders of 1941 were removed or killed. Competent commanders like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Konev emerged. Soviet tactics evolved. Soviet coordination improved. By 1943, the Red Army was a formidable fighting force. By 1944, it was arguably the most effective army in the world. June 22, 1941, represented Stalin's worst failure and his greatest lesson. The man who had trusted no one had trusted Hitler. The man who saw conspiracies everywhere had missed the real threat. The man who had eliminated potential rivals had dismissed the warnings of loyal officers. And that failure had nearly destroyed everything he had built. Stalin never forgot June 22, 1941. In the years that followed, Stalin's paranoia intensified, but in a different way. He no longer dismissed intelligence warnings. He no longer assumed that demonstrating weakness would prevent aggression. He no longer believed that potential enemies would act rationally. The lesson Stalin learned was brutal. Trust no one. Believe the worst. Prepare for betrayal. Assume the threat is real. This mindset would shape Soviet foreign policy for decades, contributing to the Cold War's tensions and the Soviet Union's fortress mentality. The historical irony is profound. Stalin's decision to trust Hitler, to dismiss warnings of German invasion, to prioritize diplomatic relations over military preparation directly caused the catastrophe of 1941. Yet Stalin's subsequent decisions, his refusal to ever again be caught unprepared, his determination to maintain massive military forces, his assumption that the West was hostile and aggressive, helped create the Cold War confrontation that defined the second half of the 20th century. June 22, 1941 shaped Stalin, and through Stalin, it shaped the world. In his Kremlin office on that morning, as reports of the invasion continued to arrive, Stalin finally understood what everyone around him had been trying to tell him for months. Hitler had betrayed him, war had begun, and the survival of the Soviet Union hung in the balance. Everything that followed, the suffering, the sacrifice, the eventual victory, all of it traced back to this moment, this realization, this day when Stalin finally acknowledged the catastrophic magnitude of his miscalculation. June 22, 1941.